So help me out. What were the key points from last class? What were the topics that we covered? What did we learn, and what do we have left to do? Norm of reaction plots. And a lot of you commented in the Socrative quiz at the end of last class that you'd like to know a little bit more about how to use them, how to interpret them. We didn't get all the way through that exercise, so that's the first thing we're going to start with today is norm of reaction plots. What was the point of doing one of these plots? What kind of question does it help us answer in terms of evolution?
It's caused by environmental or
So something about nature versus nurture right here. So is a trait that we're studying due to evolution, that is, it has a genetic basis, or is it caused, is any difference that we observe it caused entirely by environment? Which we can summarize as nature versus nurture. So today, here's the plan. We'll finish norm of reaction plots. We're going to talk about a new topic that was in the reading for today, distinguishing adaptation versus exaptation. So those are useful vocabulary words to know and a distinction to be familiar with. We'll talk briefly about the origin of species, chapter 4, which was a reading assignment, just one or two key points, including an objection to natural selection. I haven't asked all of you yet whether you believe in evolution because I don't know, I guess it doesn't really matter. You're here to learn about evolution regardless of whether or not you agree with it or not. But we'll look at one objection to natural selection and discuss that briefly, and then start a new type of assignment using your tablets, doing some collaborative group work. Has any of this stimulated any questions or concerns that anybody wants to pose at this point? No? So this is the plot we were working with last time. Quick refresher. Two populations of C. briggsii, my favorite species. They grow at different temperatures. AF16 grows in tropical temperatures, so we color it red, and HK104 is normally from cooler or blue temperatures. That's something like 20 degrees and 25 degrees. So I gave you these data points, just the two up here. So which one of those is the native temperature for one of those? 20 degrees. So that's the temperate. So this is native for the temperate strain, and it's abnormal for the Indian strain. It's a little bit cooler than the Indian strain likes, potentially. So I asked you then to make predictions. Most of you did an excellent job annotating this PDF, turning it back in. You'll see your points available on Blackboard if you earned them, which basically means you successfully submitted an annotated PDF back to Google Classroom. Okay. So that's the native temperature. So where we didn't get last time was I didn't actually tell you what happens when you grow these strains at 25 degrees. That's the experiment. If you want to know if the number of offspring these organisms have has anything to do with environment or if it's entirely genetically based, grow them at the other temperature, 25 degrees. Now 25 degrees is native for AF16, the tropical strain. So what do you expect that's the black dot, what should its fecundity, number of offspring, do if it's better adapted to life at 25 degrees? Stay the same, go up, or go down? The hypothesis is that both of these strains have adapted to life at their native temperatures. If AF16 normally grows at 25 degrees, has about 225 offspring at 20 degrees, you might expect it to go up, to increase. You move it to a temperature that it's accustomed to, maybe it will go up. So here are the actual data. Goes from 242 at 20 degrees to, on average, 248. So what do you think? What's the interpretation? Not very different. It went up on average, but not very much. So does that set suggest that for that strain, AF16, for individuals from this species from India, is their fecundity, the number of offspring they have, controlled by environment or genetics mainly? Genetics. Slope of 0, right? Horizontal line. There's no change between these two temperatures anyway. So what else would you like to know? Okay, so what happens to the other strain? So its native temperature is more like 20 degrees on average. And at that temperature it has 172. An individual worm will have 172 self-offspring. One hermaphrodite produces 172 offspring. So what do you think is going to happen when we move it to a hotter temperature? One that it's not used to.
It's going to be really close to that.
Okay, so one prediction, it's going to not change. So if AF16 looks like it's genetically controlling fecundity, then maybe HK104 is too, the blue strain. Other hypotheses?
Is it possible that one species could be more adapted to temperature changes?
Sure. Although remember, these are both individuals from the same species. They're just from different parts of the planet.
Different water temperatures.
Different ambient temperatures. Yeah?
I would say it would have a different kind of pressure, different temperature that it's not used to, so I would say it'll drop a little bit.
Okay, so if it's not used to it, maybe the hypothesis is if it's hotter or colder, if it's a change in temperature, maybe it will drop. So this, remember, 20 degrees is the average temperature that this strain is found at. So a hypothesis might be that that's its most fit temperature, and that if you move away from it, fitness would go down, the number of offspring that they have. So again, trying to reinforce the idea that there are lots of hypotheses that you can make, all of them are valid, but let's see what happens. So at 25 degrees, HK104, the temperate strain, has about 132 self-offspring per hermaphrodite. So one parent makes 132 kids. So that one drops. I haven't done the statistical tests yet, but you have. So I'm sharing, by the way, these are Otto's data. He works in my lab with me. He presented these this January at the California State University Program for Excellence in Research and Biotechnology Symposium. Yes, it is. That's why we call it C-Superb and not the California State, whatever I just said. C-Superb. So it looks like there's an effect of temperature on one of the strains at least. So AF16, the temperate or the tropical strain, the red one, didn't change much from 20 to 25 or from 25 to 20. The other one does have a bit of a slope. So what does that suggest?
About salinity levels in different areas.
Fecundity is dependent on the environment for that species or that part of the species.
So at least part of the change is likely due to environment. You make a change in the environment, it changes this trait. So there's a correlation. Okay. Now, I didn't say where these worms live. They actually live in soil. They live on rotting fruit. But there are a number of other traits that we could ask, or there are a number of environments we could change to ask how does that affect this trait. Okay. So what do you think would happen if we grew these strains at a yet cooler temperature than 20 degrees? That's not on here. Let's say we were looking at 15 degrees.
The HK one or
Both. So what do you think would happen to AF16, the red one? You grow up at 5 degrees cooler, from 20 degrees to 15 degrees.
Maybe it might be a little lower.
It could change. Might be a little lower. Maybe still up there. What about the blue one? What's its trend? Went for 25, it was lower. 20 degrees, it's a little bit higher. 15 degrees, anybody's guess. Could go up still, yeah. Okay, what happened?
It did better than it did at 25.
So the blue one,
It still went a little bit.
yeah. So HK104, the blue one, open circle, was about 158. So it didn't do quite as well as it did at 20 degrees. Last one. What happened to AF16 at 15 degrees or 16 degrees? They kept dying. So what happened?
There's only so much they could have done, I guess.
So does it look like these two different strains of the same species have adapted to life at different temperatures? Is one better at growing at warm temperatures and the other one better at growing at cool temperatures? That's all this plot tells us.
So you're saying that the home grows better at cooler temperatures than the...
Seems like it. You get cool enough, one dies. Seems kind of maladaptive. You don't do very well if you're dead. You definitely don't have any kids.
So why would one species be more adaptive than the other? Or, I'm sorry, one worm be more adaptive than the same species?
Right, so they're members of the same species. From different parts of the planet, they do better at different... So what happened? Are these worms, the HK104s and the AF16s, genetically identical to each other? They're members of the same species, but are they genetically the same or are they genetically different? They're like every species, individuals are genetically different. So it's possible that in this case, the red and the blue strains are genetically, they're still members of the same species, but there's genetic difference between them that causes this effect, this difference. So there's a mutation somewhere in the blue strain that helps it grow better at cooler temperatures. There's a different mutation in the red strain that helps it grow at warmer temperatures. You get too low, the red strain, the one that's used to tropical temperatures, just can't grow, can't survive. And by the same trait, if you grow them at 30 degrees, neither of these strains survives. That's too hot for either of them. So a key point might be that, again, when you're making normal reaction plots, often scientists just pick 2 or 3 or 4 different environmental conditions, 4 different temperatures, 3 different temperatures, a few pHs, but that never captures, if you only do a limited number of those data points, it doesn't capture the full range of the reaction that the species will have to that condition, to that trait, that characteristic of the environment. So our initial assumptions about what's happening just looking at 20 and 25 degrees maybe change now that we've also looked at a really high temperature and a really low temperature. Questions or concerns about this? So flat line means environment doesn't affect the trait. Slopes suggest that there's at least some environmental component to the trait. So what's the difference between an adaptation and an exaptation? It could be that these worms that I'm talking about have evolved to be more fit at 2 different temperatures because that's useful for them. Sounds pretty reasonable. Here's an example of an adaptation. You can't even see it because it's an adaptive trait. What's the trait? Camouflage, yeah. So this is, right, you heard about this in middle school or high school, maybe science, the Industrial Revolution in England, and there was ash polluting all the trees, and then this rare form of moth evolved heavy pigmentation. And so when it landed on these trees that were covered in ash and soot, it wasn't able to be seen very well by the predator, whereas the peppered version of the moth gets eaten. Now then, there were some papers later that suggested that maybe this study was kind of tinkered with because the scientists had actually pinned the moths to the tree, so they couldn't escape. So they were just, I mean, it was the same experiment, but it was a little bit manipulated maybe. It wasn't quite a natural experiment anyway. So here's a predator. Here's 2 moths pinned to a tree. Which one does it go for first? Does that affect the outcome? I don't know. Adaptation, whenever we use the term adaptation, that means we're talking about a change that's useful now for the same reason it was when it evolved. You'll hear a lot of evolutionary biologists talk a lot about adaptations. So let's see, a lot of you wear glasses. Here's a great example of an adaptation, right? Your nose evolved to let your glasses sit there. Right, it's a great, right? Totally. No, of course not. The nose did not evolve to let your glasses have somewhere to rest, right? So an adaptation is a change that evolved for a particular purpose, and it's still in existence because that purpose is still useful. Contrast that with an exaptation. So ad in Latin is a prefix that means toward, to or toward. So adapt, to or toward being apt or being useful or being helpful. Exaptation is away from aptation. It's going away from the purpose it originally existed for. So why is this an example, or why are these examples of exaptation?
What is the picture on the far left?
The picture on the far left is a fossil of probably Archaeopteryx, if I remember correctly. So the trait is feathers. What are feathers for?
Flight.
They're for flight. What else? Attracting mates, peacocks. What else? Warmth. Pardon?
Repels water.
Protection from the environment. Maybe ducks especially. Most fowl, but waterfowl especially. Okay, so which of those many uses of feathers was the cause for their evolution in the first place? Was it did they evolve for flight? Did they evolve for sexual signaling? Did they evolve for warmth? Did they evolve for repellence of water?
We can't really, now that you've given them all these options, we can't really just go with
Uh-oh.
one, can we?
Yeah, danger, trick question. Can't go with one, can we? So the current thinking, based on a few different lines of evidence, based on fossil record, is the idea that, and difficulties, but one idea is that feathers originally evolved for warmth, that they're an adapted form of hair, or vice versa, that hair is an adapted form, and fur is an adapted form of feathers. And that then additional changes after that led to the evolution of flight and the adaptation or the co-option of feathers for use as sexual signals to attract mates. Just one idea. Right? We can't go back in time in our time machine to find out the causes for the evolution of feathers. But it's certainly the case that if we all agree that there are multiple beneficial, uses of feathers, that most of them must be exaptations. Only one of those uses is probably the original adaptation. The rest of them just gained additional uses later. What would be really nice is to be able to go back in time and see whether or not the feathers of the dinosaurs were colored. But of course, you can't tell that at all from fossils. Maybe they originally evolved as a form of sexual signal, but we'll never know. Can anybody think of another example of an adaptation or an exaptation? Something that seems obviously useful in one way now, but you might have a question about why it exists. Some trait that has multiple uses. Noses, they help us smell, they help hold up our glasses. My nose does not help hold up my eye. Anything else like that?
Maybe like hair on one's scalp?
Hair on the scalp. So, yeah, what's the use of hair? I use it to try to attract mates. But it also keeps me warm. Others?
What about like claws on an animal? So it could be for defense and
Ah.
for prying things open.
Great, so claws on an animal, are they for defense? Or are they for like anteaters digging open termite mounds or something like that? I heard one in the back. Our thumbs. So why are our thumbs adaptive? Or are they exaptive? Right now we use them for texting, but that's obviously not that's an exaptation. What were they originally for? Holding things, right. So they improved our ability to grip, and hence we can text. What about tails?
Balance?
So there are different kinds of tails. Balance, what else do tails get used for? Holding onto trees, which is kind of a form of balance, but kind of not. I've seen a lot of animals use them to swat flies. So why did tails evolve? Did they evolve as a defense mechanism? Did they evolve for balance? Right? We don't know. I'm just trying to give you a few more examples of adaptation versus exaptation. The point being, it's very, and I'm going to look for this when you write your term papers, that you use the term adaptation in the correct way, and you don't just say that there was a change, it's adaptive. There actually has to be a lot of work, or at least intellectual defense, that is written explanation for why you claim that a trait is adaptive, that it evolved for the purpose you're talking about.
So, a way to distinguish between the two, adaptation and exaptation, could you basically say that adaptation, a new trait evolved to benefit the species, versus exaptation, where they already had something and it just has a new function,
That's
or an added function?
right, so that's the useful distinction, is the adaptation is the original function that the trait evolved for, and exaptation came later. So one of the main ways to tell whether or not a trait is adaptive or exaptive is if you're there when it happens. When a trait evolves for the first time, you can say pretty definitively that it's an adaptation. If you can prove that that trait, like the peacock feather coloration, evolved after feathers, then you could claim that it's an exaptation. The feather was there first, now the peacock's just taking advantage of the fact that it's got a place to display mating signals. Ah. Look, I got ahead of myself. Here are a few things that may be useful to keep in mind, or at least hopefully are interesting to keep in mind about what you would have read when you read chapter 4 in The Origin of Species. Just a couple of quotes. Darwin says, natural selection will be powerless in certain beneficial directions. So natural selection is not all powerful, unfortunately. So what are the sorts of things that Darwin probably, well, he probably wasn't thinking of this example when he wrote that. So what is this presumably indicating? This image? Pardon? Skin cancer. Which is an example I chose because it's particularly relevant to people of my skin coloration. Right. I've got to watch out for the UV rays because this is not me, by the way. But I hope not anyway. Why isn't natural selection powerful in eliminating cancer? Lots of cancers have genetic basis. So why do genes still predispose many of us to cancer. All types of cancer, not just skin cancer. This is an intricate question. There's a simple answer and there's a complicated answer. But why can't natural selection get rid of people that pass cancer onto their kids through mutations?
Because both of them kind of rely on mutations.
So if I inherit from my dad, or mom, which I probably did, a predisposition to getting melanomas, why can't natural selection get rid of those mutations by killing off, essentially, the individuals that have those mutations? There are a couple reasons.
Isn't it because, like, after the dads pass on their genes, after they have the kids, that the cancer gets developed?
Right. So the point here is that cancer is usually a disease of the aged. You often don't get cancer until you're getting older, most types of cancer. There are a few exceptions. So what's happened by the time you get cancer? You already reproduced and passed the mutations on to the next generation. So natural selection is powerless to get rid of cancer-causing mutations when those are cancers that old people get, because natural selection is only useful for getting rid of mutations if it kills individuals or makes them less fit before they reproduce and pass the genes on to the next generation. There's another reason that natural selection is less and less effective against disease these days, but that's our fault. That would be medical intervention. So we can extend the lives of people that probably would die of genetic diseases before they were able to reproduce, and then those mutations could be passed on to their offspring. I'm not arguing against curing childhood diseases, but it's an interesting point to consider. Like, is it ethical, or is it good for the human species, at least, to treat childhood genetic disorders medically? What does that do to our species? And by the way, I'm not biased in this because I had brain surgery before I started having kids, so it's a little bit hypocritical for me to say that I believe in not treating, although that wasn't a genetic cause for what I had brain surgery for, but I'm a little bit conflicted, so I'm not saying that we should just stop treatment of all childhood genetic disorders. But it's an important conversation for our society to have, in my opinion. Questions about this? Okay. Here's the most famous one, right? So objections to natural selection. Say you don't agree with natural selection and maybe you want to use this argument against the idea of survival of the fittest. So in the economy of nature, if something isn't needed, like the male nipple, then why does it still exist if natural selection's actually working?
It's not selected for or against.
Okay, so yeah, if they're not beneficial, they're not selected for, but if they're not causing a loss of fitness, natural selection wouldn't select against the trait. So it'd have to be, I'll leave it to you to come up with some sort of scenario in which the male nipple would be selected against. I could probably come up with some, but I'm not sure if I'd want them recorded on my tablet. So, but that's the sort of idea. The same with the appendix, right? We still have organs that we don't really understand what their use is. They still exist in us. It's probably because there's not much cost in developing those organs, so natural selection just hasn't gotten rid of them from our species yet.
Dr. Ross?
Yeah.
Have they done any sort of experiments where they've genetically modified an organism to develop without an appendix?
I don't know of any cases where scientists have artificially developed organisms that don't have an appendix to see what the effect might be. Or, for that matter, without male nipples. I'll take a look, though. I haven't looked specifically to find out whether those studies exist. I think I have an idea of where to look, though. This is, by the way, I'm glad I don't think Fresno State pays attention or tracks what you search on the internet for, but as a biologist, you search for some pretty interesting things, so I'm glad no one's keeping track. One more quote. I didn't put up any examples, but maybe you could think of some examples. Again, the point being that natural selection doesn't necessarily mean survival of the individual who's the fittest, or death to the least fit. It just means at least that the least fit individual doesn't pass his or her genes on to the next generation. So in this case, death is equivalent to not reproducing. So those are basically equivalent concepts in evolution. And that takes us back to the first or second day of class where I suggested that most evolutionary biologists, if you ask them, would say that the purpose of life is to reproduce. It kind of stems from this concept. Okay, so I wanted to leave some time in class for starting a new type of group exercise. So in a couple minutes, I'm going to ask everybody to get in small groups. The concept of the groups is that we're also going to use some group activities probably during exams. Crazy and unfamiliar and fun at the same time, I hope you find. So I wanted to form groups before the exams rolled around so that you had a chance to get to know each other and to practice working together. So, as a brief introduction to what we're going to start off doing, by the way, rap is not my favorite genre, but this happens to be a relevant one. Okay, so we don't have to go through the whole thing. You can watch this yourself on YouTube if you want. Okay, so that's Baba Brinkman, by the way. Was anybody here a couple of years ago when he came to campus and he has an entire album called The Rap Guide to Evolution, which he performed over in next to the Save Mart Center. What? It doesn't matter. So Baba's been here before, and he raps on all things. He's not a scientist. He's actually an artist. Well, he's an artist. He's an actor. But he got into rapping about scientific concepts a while ago. He also has a rap guide to the Canterbury Tales. And he's currently working on one on global warming. So an album of raps regarding global warming. So that's an introduction. The concept, which I think I've mentioned previously, is what I'd like you to do is to form groups of students. Don't do it yet. Let's work through what we're going to do. Introduce yourselves. One of you create a Google Doc. So and I'll show you a short video that I made in just a second for how to do this. Write, all of you together, in that one document, collaboratively write one verse of lyrics summarizing one key point from natural selection. It doesn't have to be a song, rap, whatever. Just something that rhymes, hopefully, maybe. It's up to you. right? Something that, just a short stanza, one verse, having something to do with natural selection. Make a summary. Make sure that that Google Doc also contains a list of your group members, and then also include me, so you invite, as you'll see in the movie that explains how to do this, invite all of your group members to join that document, plus invite me. And then post this by 6 p.m. tomorrow. It doesn't have to be great. This is just practice working on this workflow. So let's check out this brief tutorial that I created. And this is on YouTube, so you can use it later.
Click on the plus in the bottom right-hand corner. Select New Document. Give your document a title. I prefer if you start with the year, the month, and the day, and the course number. In this case. And the names of your group members. Then choose Create.
So
And
that
in this case, I already
one of you
have
now has
some
made a
text
Google
already.
Doc.
So if I hold down my finger on the key, I can paste it in.
There's my
This
lyrics.
contains a header that I'd like you to use, the chapter number and section that the assignment is related to, and then again, the full names of all of your group members. So in this case, I've written a little verse, a song or rap that I might use to explain what's in chapter 3.1.
We've got skills, people.
About survival. Now, what I want to do, though, before I've written this text, what you should do before your group starts working is to choose the three.
Remember, one of your group members has made this. Now you have to invite the other group members to be able to see this document.
Menu you can use to share and export. And this is how you share this Google Doc that you created with others. So I'll click the share button. And then I can add in email addresses of individuals that I want to add to this Google Doc. You want to make sure that the pencil icon, the drop-down menu is selected. That is, the people that you are inviting to view this document can also edit. And then we click the paper airplane icon, the triangle is pointed to the right, to share. In this case, because I'm sharing it with an email address that's not the mail.fresnostate.
So you should all use your mail.fresnostate.edu account email addresses for
In
this.
your case, all of you should be using your mail.fresnostate.edu email addresses, and you should not then see this